The host for the 5th National Reconciliation Week breakfast held in Devonport this morning is Karen Smart, a proud Tasmanian Aboriginal with family links to the Fernab Islands and the northwest of the state, with extensive networks throughout Tasmanian Aboriginal communities, and as a member of the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre and the Six Rivers Aboriginal Corporation. Karen is a warm and spirited Aboriginal woman. She has her own enterprise encouraging Palawa and Pakana youth to learn more about cultural traditions. I feel privileged to welcome her to the stage today to host this important event. Two wonderful speakers. Karen Smart.
Thank you, Mark. Yapalina Nina, Yapalina Nina, Yapalina Nohina. I acknowledge my old people who lived on this beautiful country that we stand on today. I pay respects to the elders of past, present and our future elders, up and coming. And my people as the strong community that they are in this moment. Our women gave birth, gathered food and resources, hunted seals and possums, collected ochre, rounded up on their balcony stones and took care of their families. Our men hunted and protected their families. The community exchanged news, shared an abundance of resources on this very land that we stand today. The Palawa culture is unique, alive and strong. We should honour the old people, our women, men and children, who lived in rhythm with the seasons as the first peoples of Tasmania. As the first people, we care for our country to ensure the continuation of our culture by passing on our knowledge onto the next generation. Thank you for this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners, my people, and to welcome you to this gathering of all of us here today in good spirit. While we are here together, I ask that you make time to reflect on the first peoples of this land, especially the women and the men and the children, and the life world that they once enjoyed for over 2,000 generations. Nairi Ninatu, thank you. I would like to welcome the board of the Reconciliation Tasmania and thank you for organising this event, and all our special guests that we have here today. Our first special guest that we have today is Dave Gough. Dave is a celebrated artist, curator and cultural practitioner, dedicated to interpreting and demonstrating Aboriginal practices for all Australian people to bring communities together and preserve our traditional culture. As a proud Trawlwoolway man, descended from bunganna chief Manalargenna's oldest daughter, of Northeast Tasmania, I'll get Dave to say that. Dave has a strong personal connection to Tasmania and its people, and now through his artistic practice, he's committed to giving back to the community. Dave's work as a cultural practitioner offers a valuable and positive role in reconciling different groups and breaking down stereotypes. He shares his culture, knowledge and passion with educators and students throughout the state, from primary schools right through to those in University of Tasmania. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Karen. I always like to start with acknowledging Moyeni, our great creator, Dromadini, our star spirit. Without them, we wouldn't be here. The first Palawa wouldn't have been created, and we wouldn't have come down the Star Bridge to our beautiful country. To acknowledge our elders that are past, our elders that are with us, our future leaders and warriors, and to acknowledge everybody that is here today at the Paranapple Centre, the mouth of this river where my family have been since 1847. Karen mentioned I'm a Trawlwoolway man. Through my mother and my mother's side of my family, we are traditionally from the the northeast of this country. And through the period of time of displacement, my family ended up this river. We ended up this river in 1847 because of having to find ways of surviving. My family is very well documented. In that period of time, Karen couldn't quite pronounce her name, but Woretemoeteyenner is the oldest daughter of bunganna chief Manalargenna. And while she was incarcerated on Flinders Island for 8 years, her daughter Devonport was with a convict called Thomas Johnson, and she learned to read and write. It was important for her to learn how to navigate the world that was coming towards them. In that learning to read and write, she also learned that she found her mother had been changed to Margaret, and she was on Flinders Island. And so she wanted to try and get her mother, who was elderly, off Flinders Island. She wrote a letter to the governor, but she was also informed that if she got a support letter from Captain Moriarty, that would help the cause, which it did. It's the only person freed from incarceration, and I know that through our family, she wanted to get her sisters and other family members. That period of time was brutal. So Woretemoeteyenner got released and spent 8 years at least with the family, and they lived in Denorlan, where she passed by the fire with her family after 8 years, teaching and sharing traditions with the young kids. Our family then, Captain Moriarty was leaving Denorlan, the military post, and he suggested that there was some land up the river here called Moriarty, which his sister had, Lucinda. She called it Moriarty after a town where they'd come from, which meant a town. They had thought about building a town there, but it was too wet and was flooding. So he said to our family, "You'll be safe there." Our family came up the back way, which is now Native Rock Road, and they travelled through Denorlan, from Denorlan through Deloraine and through the back way to get to what is now Relton Road, and they set up and lived there. The first people that came and took land in that area, George Atkinson's family, which is on the river there. There is statues and memorials to the Atkinson family as the founders of what they call now Latrobe. But our family, an Aboriginal family, built the first bridge across this river, built the first inns, and my great-grandfather rolled River Road from a track to the road that it is today. Our family have been in this area since that period of time, and is the first family in this area, so we have a very strong connection to it. It's a second home country for our family, the Briggs mob. My family are in this river. When Dalrymple passed up in Latrobe, her grave got washed into the river in the mouth of this river, where the salt and fresh water meet. The Paranapple is part of my bloodline now. And our family hold that dear. This is a place of survival, but a place that we are an integral part of the foundations of this city. In acknowledging, but I also like to clap sticks, and I'd like you to clap with me so we all become one here today. Let me hear you clap.
Trawlwoolway, yeah. Come on, yeah.
So a little bit about my family history. And my table I have Uncle Merv Gough, who's an elder of my family line here, and Karen is also family. We all go back to basically 4 daughters of bunganna, Manalargenna. So we are very heavily connected. And through displacement and coming back together, we will be stronger. Just going to have a sip of water. It's a bit early. I don't know why we set breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning. As black fellas like me, we like to get up late because we stay up late. So I just want to sort of start a little bit about reconciliation. And to see so many people and faces that I know here, I thank you for coming. I haven't had a lot to do in this space. I work in it heavily, but I don't have a lot to do with it. It's an interesting thing. I suppose part of my bio was about how I bring people together. And that's what I enjoy to do. I have beautiful, fantastic, non-Aboriginal champions in my life. My wife is one of those. And she supports me every day with the stuff that I go through as an Aboriginal man today. The challenges that I face, the things that keep me up at night, and the possibilities of what we can do today. The things that we strive for our families, for the recognition of our families, our histories, and the truth, to bring our young ones up in a pathway that we can form and shape that is stronger and better and more clear than the ones that we had growing up. The freedom to be who we are and the strength in the steps that we take and in those pathways that we form. I'll just ask you to have a look up at the screen. Because I was brought up with those words around actions speak louder than words. And if you look up there, there's an old action that we all know. We all love that song, that Paul Kelly song. And then you look on the other picture up there, something that happened probably last year, which caused a whole lot of stuff in the media, about $25 million to get our flag up on that bridge. And the debacle in that. But then the positivity of taking down the New South Wales flag and raising our flag always got me when I went to Sydney and saw such a huge Australian flag and didn't see our flag, and how that would affect the Aboriginal people in their city, on their river. Just like to say, this man is a champion, and thinking of him and his family as he takes a break. If we have a look up here, we'll see some stuff around the champion that started the process in the early years, but also they're still just as tough today. But the journeys that everybody has tried to do over many, many years to try to make pathways and make changes. And the community and the good people that try to assist in those changes, and then hit walls with governments and policies in the way that they can try to dismantle policies or make things change in amongst legislation is so much more complicated. The reason why I'm going to bring some of this stuff up is because of the word reconciliation. It's something I haven't sat well with as a word, because our people never had a relationship to reconcile. But the actions and the intent of the reconciliation process in trying to find better ways and processes for equality, for the truth, and all the things that we're heading towards today. Today there are multiple prongs heading towards multiple prongs. There's multiple things happening at once, and we know that. if you look at that, is there another word? And you start to look at the words, and the power of words are quite confronting, because when you put a word on something, it becomes something and it might not be what you wanted it to be. Then you'd be freely using a word. Is it the right word? These are words that are related to reconciliation. But in amongst those, I see words like compromise and conformity, 50-50 deal, adaptation, conformity. You do see harmony. You do see sympathy, treaty. I was in Wales a couple of years ago, and I was on country with some traditional people, and they shared a word with me in their language that meant connection to country. I sat with that for a long time, trying to think of one in our language. And sometimes a look and a feeling and a connection might not need the word. I don't know. But when you look at all of these words in relation to reconciliation, and then you think about this room, and I think we're all here because we want to be here. I hope that's the case, and that we want action. The action's got to come from the people, to push the government to open up their books, open up their legislations and change them to suit what society deems appropriate today. I'm not here to push any views or opinions on anyone. I'm not here representing any organisation. I'm part of many. But my feelings towards the journey we're all on is so important, and we're at a part of history where we can push things over. We can make change. And we are. So the reconciliation movement has been going a long time. In 2014, I welcomed Dr. Fred Chaney at the small centre next door when he came from reconciliation, bringing the campaign of recognised Aboriginal people in the Constitution. I did the welcome to country at that, an acknowledgement, and at that event I spoke at the beginning about the need for finding better ways for our people, the truth to be told about what happened, to work through some healing processes, work through steps towards equality, but also not just equality. We fight for land rights. There's been many generations that have been let down by government with broken promises, and it's time for people like yourselves to be the champions that you can be, to push for the changes that need to happen. A lot of words. I was in a meeting the other week, and a very, very strong Aboriginal woman from Western Australia brought this up as well, as in reconciliation. Her opinion was it's a religious word from the Bible, to reconcile. But it does have things written in amongst all of this that forgiveness may be one-sided, but reconciliation requires both parties to be willing to participate in restoring the relationship. This was taken from the Pathway to Treaty Report 2021 with Professor Kate Warner and Professor Tim McCormack's report. And in looking at this, the word itself had to be navigated in Canada as well, with their First Peoples, not feeling comfortable with the word. And down the bottom there it says, a young Aboriginal woman, Aria Ritz, speaking at a forum recently organised by Reconciliation Tasmania, said, it's a white person's word. I can't reconcile if you were never together. There's several statements in that, and it's important to be able to, you can go online and read that report, but to see that it's the same in Canada, it's the same here, but the movement has still continued to be a movement. But the word has been uncomfortable, and Aboriginal people, even myself, has felt compromised by coming into the space to say, I'm supporting it. It's because of the word. I think that setting important steps forward and key milestones towards advancement is important, and having those as measurable and managed outcomes. Reconciliation, third line down, I've highlighted it. It's a little bit about our history here. The conciliator, George Augustus Robinson. So for those of you who haven't done research on our history, it's an important thing for you to do, so you understand why our people have very little trust in government or people that have come to agreements with our people because of what happened with our ancestors, and these things have happened again and again. The handshake. This is a little bit about Manalargenna, and I just encourage you as Tasmanians to do some learning and understanding about our family. Like I said, I come from his oldest daughter. Most of us do come from our bunganna. Okay, so Little Musselrow Bay, home country for us. This morning I developed my plans to the Chief Manalargenna and explained to him the benefit views of the government towards himself and people. He quarterly requested. So if you read this, you'll get to see these next few slides talk about the agreements between the government and our ancestors, our people, who tried to find ways of surviving and had to put levels of trust into that. So these are recorded in Robinson's journal, which is around the agreements of us having a treaty for our people to be able to return to our home countries and our homelands. And this is the stuff that never happened. And today, at the moment, we're only just starting in this state a process towards treaty. Some of the last people that were rounded up was Oyster Bay and the Big River tribe. And they went in the end as free people, but under the agreements of what was going to happen to stop the conflict. This is on Woretemoeteyenner, Flinders Island. Woretemoeteyenner was named that as in black man's houses. It was a camp where our people went, and we were put there, and religion and not being able to practice culture had a huge impact. Same with the foods and everything else, but the broken heart of our people is in that place. But you can see there what the commandant said. Not many of our people got from Waipalena back to their big island, and the ones that did obviously were taken to a colonial post in cold freezing conditions and were dying there as well. This is a line that Robinson wrote, and Robinson obviously was the one who rounded our people and spent 4 years taking our people and doing what he did. And this is quite a powerful statement that led to a book being called A Week in Silence. So our bunganna died within weeks of being on the island, and while he was being transported to the island, he cut off his ochre dreadlocks and his beard. He was a broken man because of that promise that he realised was not going to happen. This petition was written by some incredible people on the island. Walter George Arthur, his family were the Ben Lomond tribe, and David Bruni, his father was Woretemoeteyenner, the chief of Bruni Island. This is the sad bit at the end where this is the Week in Silence part where Robinson wrote this. Because he saw our people on home country, he spent many, many nights with them. He watched them sing and dance and hunt. And then he saw what the outcome was and what that turned into on Flinders Island and Waipalena. Like I said, this isn't doom and gloom, because where we are today is we have many things happening at once. We have a room here full of hundreds of people that want to see better outcomes for our people. We have resisted assimilation. Woretemoeteyenner keeps me going, my ancestral grandmother. Our people are so strong. When we walk every day, we get up, we sleep, we walk on our country. Our ancestors give us the strength to be who we are. We're not going to not be who we are. We are not going to assimilate. We are very proud. What we do want is what was promised to us back in the day. So the displacement of our people and what has happened has caused frictions and dissettlements between our own people. When you take people away from each other for 6 generations and put them in different parts of country that's not traditional homelands, and you break down all of our structures, our language and our connections, but bit by bit we're all coming back together. And the strong thing that is doing that is what Karen does with the kids and what we do. We're bringing back our old cultures and our strength through our connections, our barefoot dancing, our putting our ochres on, and bringing back the pride in who we are, and making sure our young ones grow up with that pride. It is so important that we continue to do that. We don't do it as a fun thing or performance. At times we bring you all together to be part of that. You feel the energy that we've got when we're connected. You will totally understand, and I'm sure some of you have been with us when we do that. Those words I put up there, the champions are required to set the pathways for change. Be that champion. We can't change the date, but you can. You can push the things that we're asking for. The deep listening, having relationships. There's many R's. I had a joke with a very famous Aboriginal dancer years ago when Recognise was the campaign, and then back into reconciliation. What are the R's? There is repatriation. there is respect, there is relationships. There's many, many words that we can use, but the actions will come from us as a society today. I want to thank you for listening to me. I hope you do some research to understand why we have very little faith in governments. You can see even broken handshakes. So let's try to understand why we feel the way we do. But when there's a gap in the fence, I want to smash it open. I want to make that pathway for our people. And I know that the people in this room want to do that with us. So there's opportunities coming. I'm not going to spruik where we're at, but in 1967 we got counted. In 2023 we can get heard. The Constitution is very important, because if we're not in the Constitution that we actually get a voice, we're going to be in the same situation we're in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Just like to announce breakfast has been served. I encourage you to visit the information tables in the foyer. The Yes campaign has a table to visit and to ask questions. RT has an information table and people can use the QR code on their tables to sign up and become members. We also have a selection of books which are available for sale at Devonport Bookshop, and go and check out the information at the tables in the foyer. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our next keynote speaker, Ray Martin. Ray Martin's lifetime in journalism began as an ABC cadet in Sydney in 1965. After working in Perth and Canberra, he was posted to New York for a decade as the ABC's North American correspondent. In 1978, he switched to Channel 9 to launch 60 Minutes with George Negus and Anne Leslie, the award-winning program he still reports for today. In between, he hosted Midday for a decade, the best decade, so that's where I get paid. A current affair for almost as long, and countless network specials. Federal elections and carols by candlelight, winning 5 gold Logies, more than 20 silver Logies, and an unmatched number of People's Choice Awards. He's definitely charming. He was awarded an Order of Australia in 2011 for his journalism, his work with Indigenous Australians, and his long involvement with charities. As chairman of the Fred Hollows Foundation and the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, patron of Indigenous Jobs Program, patron for 30 and patron for the Humpty Dumpty Foundations, who supply medical equipment for children's hospitals and clinics, in particular Indigenous clinics. He was also involved in the Aboriginal employment strategy. His best-selling autobiography, Ray, Stories of My Life, was published in 2009. In recent years, Ray has been in demand on centre stage to interview in conversation with many international celebrities, including Al Pacino, Sir David Attenborough, Dame Jane Goodall, and Bill Bryson, to name a few. In 2014, Ray presented the first season of the landmark SBS documentary series First Contact, with the second season airing in 2016. Ray featured in the Australian version of the popular international franchise genealogy television documentary series Who Do You Think You Are? It's exciting to have Ray here for a number of reasons. He has strong links to Tasmania, as he spent his high school years in Launceston, having his first ever foray in journalism at Launceston High School, where he was an editor of the school magazine, a radio operator. He has been champion of reconciliation in Australia for over 40 years, in education, health and job programs, even before he discovered his Kamilaroi ancestry in the early 1990s. An article written by his daughter Jenna Martin on SBS describes how Ray travelled the world as a journalist, but always said, "When I go bush, I breathe easier." No one talked. She said he never understood why Outback felt like home, but felt it all his life long before he actually knew he had Indigenous heritage that tied him even more intimately to the land. Ray covered most Tassie stories for 60 Minutes and A Current Affair, given his Tassie connections, and subsequently became a brand Tasmania ambassador for about a decade, with Tetsuya, the international famous chef, which meant he travelled around Tassie about 5 times a year. Ray says as a history honours student, he was told in 1959 that no Tasmanian Aboriginals had survived after Trawlwoolway. In 2011, Ray was awarded an Order of Australia for journalism and worked in Indigenous affairs plus honorary doctorate from Sydney University, again for journalism and work in Indigenous affairs. So this has not been a passing interest, but a deep, long commitment. Thank you, Ray.
Wow, I don't have to speak. You must have read my speech. Sorry folks, I'll bore you with some of that same stuff again. But it is kind of... Hello everybody, thank you for inviting me to be here this morning. Thank you for coming. It would have been an awful lonely breakfast with just me and Dave, I've got to tell you, but I used to be Ray Martin. It's funny, you know, when you spend a lifetime on television 8 days a week, and then you pull back, people think that you're retired, or even worse. A true story, I was up on the Gold Coast late last year, doing a documentary for the 7 Network. I do documentaries these days mostly. I was standing outside the Southport police station, waiting for a break in the traffic so that I could record a brief piece to camera for this documentary. And a typical Gold Coast bloke came along. He was about 50, shorts and a beer gut, and thongs, and one of those sort of melanoma suntans you get on the Gold Coast. And I won't read the language, but he stopped when he saw me, he did a double take and he pointed. And he said, "Jesus, Mike, I thought you was dead." I laughed and I said, "That's not very nice. My name is not Mike." So he sputtered an apology. Sorry, he said. "You look pretty good for a dead bloke. George. So, well, sometimes you just can't win. When Kirsten and Mark first invited me here a few months ago, I thought, they said, you know, could I sort of really tell my journey in the black and white space in Australia. But I thought Reconciliation Week, The Voice and Tassie ticks 3 pretty important boxes for me. I've been walking the Reconciliation Road now for, as Karen said, about more than 30 years. In the early 1980s with Professor Fred Hollows on Aboriginal health, especially blindness, I was chairman of his foundation for the first 10 years. I think there are about 8 million people around the world who can see now, have cataracts, who can see because of the result of Fred Hollows Foundation, which is extraordinary. I worked on a number of Aboriginal jobs programs, as was mentioned, and by Karen, and I was the first chairman of the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation. Education, I'm convinced, if there is one, is the silver bullet if you're going to close the gap of disadvantage. It's about education. I was on the National Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation for 10 years, listening to what Dave had to say. That was very interesting. Longer than anybody, it was a high-powered council. That included Linda Burney, who's currently the Federal Minister, of course, Senator Pat Dodson, who was our sort of Mandela, Kamilaroi Napinga, the first Aboriginal Australian of the Year, who died recently up in the Northern Territory, sadly, and Lower O'Donoghue, who was the first boss of ATSIC in, I think, its best days. Probably the most influential Indigenous woman we've had up to now. Loach once told me that Prime Minister Paul Keating offered her the post of Governor-General, but she knocked it back. A member of the stolen generation, she was taken when she was about 3 with her 2 sisters. And she sadly ended her long life, she's now has dementia, not knowing whether she was black or whether she was white. Attacked by both sides, she kept saying. She wasn't whingy, she was just stating a fact. About the same time as I joined the RECTAS Election Council and had just started working in Aboriginal health with Professor Hollows, I discovered that my great-great-grandmother, whose name is Bertha, was a Kamilaroi woman, an elder in northern New South Wales, near Gunnedah, where my mother and my sisters were all born. Bertha lived till she was 104. That's how old, at least they guessed she was. Nobody had the records, but that's as close. There was a photograph in the local paper that I had at home with this 5-foot-tall woman with a white afro haircut, smoking a big pipe. And I'll tell you a bit more about that particular sort of shock to the family when we discovered that in a minute. The second box I mentioned is the voice. As Dave was mentioning at the end of his speech, it's simply, I think, the right and decent thing for Australians to do. And I'll tell you why I think that in a moment. As for Tassie, my third box, well, it is like coming home, as Karen was saying. I did my secondary school at Launceston High, as it was known then. Launceston High School was a selective school, but my education, I think, was mostly about sport. So I came down here to Devonport playing inter-high footy and inter-high cricket, and we had the selection trials here in Devonport for the under-16 Tasmanian basketball team, I remember, one weekend, so I have very fond memories of this town. I did a lot of stories for 60 Minutes, as Karen said, in the current affair in Tassie. I was an ambassador for Brand Tasmania again. Back in Launceston, I must have done some schoolwork, I think, because I ended up getting a Commonwealth scholarship, which paid my way through Sydney Uni. My mum worked at Pape and Baldwin's knitting mills and machinists, so we certainly couldn't afford for me to go to uni. I did history honours, with plans to be a history lecturer at some stage, but I jumped the fence and I joined the ABC instead, ran off with the circus of television and radio. 58 years later, no complaints about my career choice. I've loved it. Although I still love history with a passion, especially Australian colonial history, which is very relevant, I think, to what I'm going to talk about today. A couple of quick questions, question and answers, so I can better understand the mob I have with me here today. First, I'll be honest, how many people haven't yet decided whether they're going to vote yes or no on the upcoming voice referendum? Be honest, how many haven't decided? Good on you, thank you. This isn't a lock here, it's your choice. So pretty much I'm preaching to the converted with other people here today. Let's talk to those people who haven't made their minds up. I'll come back to that. Second question, are there any Indigenous Tasmanians here, apart from David? Okay. No, you can't be, that's impossible. That's impossible, you don't exist, as Karen said. I'm kidding, of course, but it wasn't 50, I think it was later than 58, it was that last year of high school, in 63 in Launceston. My very, very learned history teacher, a guy named Percy Pearce, whom I think ended up here in Devonport as the head of history at Devonport High. Anyway, Percy Pearce told us that all Tasmanian Aborigines had died when Truganini passed away in 1877. Sadly, they were all gone. He said the first Tasmanians were extinct. We were told by this history elite at this selective high school. Wiped out like the Tassie tiger. In fact, long before the Tassie tiger. Now, I read at last count, we talked about it last night at dinner, in the last census there were about 31,180 Tasmanians who today identify as Indigenous. So where did they all come from? They were to the history books. Well, I was there. So this morning, as always, I pay my deep respects to the traditional custodians of this beautiful land in which we gather, and to the elders and the spirits we hope still take care of this place. But how do the historians get it so wrong? Why all these lies about Aboriginal people? Again and again. It's been part of the reconciliation problem, I think, Dave. Let's pretend they don't exist. Part of that assimilation process that we went through and started to get out of. Again and again, it's not the case. Not just in Tassie, of course, but right across the country. So in preparing what I was going to say to you this morning, I was flicking through my own considerable library of history books, the usual culprits, the Australian history icons like Manning Clark, and Dutton and Blaney, and before that Sir Walter Murdoch across the University of WA. The shocking and shameful extermination of the first Tasmanians gets a bit of a passing acknowledgement in our history books. But the black-white wars across the wider Australian landscape are conspicuous by their absence, by their silence, until Tasmania's own professor, Henry Reynolds, comes along and starts to shine an academic torchlight into some very dark places, no pun intended. I want to read you something from this book that underlines what I'm talking about. Then I'll briefly tell you some of my personal stories, which I was asked to do. Russell Ward, who wrote that book, wrote this paper back in 1967, about the same time as the Referendum, the most successful yes vote in Australian history until now. Now, Russell Ward is one of those iconic historians I mentioned, professor of history at Newcastle University for a while with many books. He was an old lefty academic, so he should have known better. But in this potted history book of his, simply called Australia, Professor Ward refers to the indigenous people as the mild Aborigines, who even, he says, even when they were subjected to violent or outrageous acts by whitefellas, their reaction, he says, quote, was so ineffectual that men seldom had to go armed on the Australian frontier, quote unquote. The esteemed historian goes on to say, sounding almost sanguine about it, as the white settlers advanced inland to occupy new grazing land, tribe after tribe disintegrated, he says, when his traditional organisations broke down and his hunting grounds were stolen. No mention of the automatic rifles and the wholesale massacres. These people just disintegrated. We now know that's completely untrue, but how did these historical lies ever get written? And how were they perpetrated? How did this academic misinformation just keep going? Again and again, research shows clearly today, in the last 20 years especially, since a local professor, that Aborigines fought almost every inch of the whitefella takeover of their traditional lands, that they didn't just disintegrate. From day one in Australia, convicts building the Parramatta Road out of Sydney town were issued with pistols to protect themselves against constant spear attacks. The life-saving farms along the Hawkesbury River were abandoned for more than a year, about the time of the quarry, because of Aboriginal attacks. And as the frontier expanded from the 1820s to the 1890s on the mainland, beyond here, farmers never left the house without a gun, not even to go down to the shed. There were pitched battles on the Liverpool Plains of New South Wales, where my mum come from, the Darling Downs in Queensland, and up in the Gough country, at the same time as the Indian Wars were happening in America. No movies, no John Wayne telling stories about the Australian Aborigines. As a result of their relentless attacks, here as well of course, whites retaliated and Aboriginal massacre sites litter the Australian landscape. From the first fleet days up until the 1930s, not 1830s, but 1930s in parts of the Kimberley and the Northern Territory. The absurdity of Professor Russell Ward's misinformation about mild Aborigines disintegrating is breathtaking. How do we perpetuate such lies? Just a side note to the history books, Aboriginal Australia simply doesn't exist either in the poems and the prose of our most popular writer of the 1890s to the early 1930s, Henry Lawson and Banjo Patterson. Their rollicking doggerel and their heartbreaking yarns are all about brave, indomitable British and Irish pioneers and settlers, whitefellas, who battled Mother Nature on the frontier and were often beaten by drought and flood and fire in this unforgiving sunken country beyond the Great Divide. Banjo and Henry laughed and cried with white Australia. They held up a mirror, but the faces of Indigenous Australians simply did not appear. They don't appear. There's one Henry Lawson poem about blackfellas in their poetry and prose. Again, the policy seemed to be, or the attitude was, let's pretend they don't exist. So let me turn to some personal stories about my own reconciliation journey. After all, I am a storyteller, not a politician. I grew up in New South Wales bush, as Karen said. I lived in 13 different towns before Launceston, where I stayed for the full 5 years of my high school and then went back to New South Wales. We used to holiday at my grandmother's place up in Gunnedah in northwest New South Wales. That's where I first became aware of racism. I saw it, but as a kid, of course, I didn't really understand what it was about and how insidious it was. It was just life in the bush. The Indigenous people, the Kamilaroi people, lived in camps down by the bridge on the other side of the Namoi River in Gunnedah. And they would come up to the picture show on a Saturday night, for example, often with their own pillows and their own blankets in the winter. And they'd sit right down the front on the floor looking up at the screen, not on the seats but down the front. And when the films had finished, they were hunted out of town by the police back to their camps. They usually went quietly back down. I remember one blistering summer's day lying on our towels with my 3 elder sisters. We'd been for a swim and we're now bathing in coconut oil, again getting melanoma, as I said earlier, as we did in those innocent days. And 3 boys came into the pool, about the same age as me, about 10. The lifeguard hosed them down before they were allowed to have a swim, hosed them down. And curious, I asked my sisters why. Well, that's because they're Aborigines, my sister said. The boys were not dirty, no more than me anyway, and they copped the hosing without objections and they went for a swim. That was racism, Gunnedah style, when I grew up. Across at Moree, just down the Kamilaroi highway as it's called now, I remember Aboriginal people weren't even allowed to go into the hot thermal council pools, the baths there, or even to play on the council's grass tennis court. Blackfellas didn't go there. That was racism, Moree style. But 10 years later, I'd finished my cadetship at the ABC and I was sent to Perth as a reporter. That's where I first saw apartheid, not just racism, but apartheid in action in Australia. And I was appalled. In Perth itself, the treatment of Aboriginal people by police and by bus drivers and by public officials was routinely racist, there was no question about it. But I went up to a place called Meekatharra, about 750 k's north, to do a half-hour radio documentary called The End of the Line, which is what Meekatharra was, at the end of the railway line. It was a wicked place. An old gold mining town in the middle of nowhere. It was pockmarked by abandoned slag heaps. The waste from the gold diggings arrived on an Ansett DC-3 plane at that stage. It's the same plane I caught to Launceston from Melbourne when Mum and I came over. It was a Thursday, the welfare check day up in Meekatharra. A mob of Aboriginal women had taken shelter under the shade of the trees in the narrow main street of Meekatharra. I booked into one of the 2 pubs in town. There were no motels, only pubs. It was strictly for white fellas, this pub, no question. The black fellas' pub was a dump on the other side of the street, a no-go zone. The Catholic priest, the Anglican minister whom I went round and talked to, subsequently told me shocking stories of the rampant racism that was sort of South Africa in Australia. And the next day I went with the Flying Doctor out to Wooloona, which is the start of that famous canning stock route, on the edge of the Western Desert in Western Australia, another old gold mining town. At the Wooloona Medical Centre, there was no hospital, medical centre. The doctor, whom I'd flown with, attended to a couple of local white women from a nearby station who had just driven up in their Land Rovers. Aboriginal women and children who'd been waiting in the sun and in the red dirt for a long time, maybe hours, came last. They were treated last by this doctor. I went with the local police sergeant out to the Blacks camp where we were told a girl was very sick. We came upon her in agony from an appendicitis attack, being carried by her mother and her father into town in their arms. The dad was carrying. The sergeant helped the girl into the back of his Land Rover. He said that her mother could jump in as well, but that her father would have to walk the 2 miles into town. And off we went, leaving him in our dust. At the hospital, the Flying Doctor said we'd have to transfer the 9-year-old girl back to Meekatharra. But there was no room for her mother. Now I offered to stay behind in Wooloona, but the doctor said he wasn't taking the mother anyway. He said these black fellas are too much bloody trouble. And that was it, away we went with the girl. Back in Meekatharra, I got talking to an Indigenous man who worked as a clerk at the council. He was about 50. I was about 20 or something like that. So he seemed like an old fella. We were sitting on the veranda of the blackfellas pub I was probably one of the few white fellas to actually drink at the pub, and I got reprimanded when I went back to my pub a little later. Anyway, this bloke had been born further up the West Australian coast at Roebourne. He told me that how as a 10-year-old boy he could remember the first T-model Ford coming into Roebourne. It was owned by, went across the cobblestone roads of Roebourne, he very colourfully described. It was owned by a woman boss of a local cattle station, and he said that everyone, they were all bedazzled by this newfangled motor vehicle, so it had to be sometime back in the 1920s. He also told me how he'd been stopped by the local copper on horseback, was accused of being one of a group of blackfellas who'd stolen 2 cattle. He insisted that he was innocent to the copper, but the policeman put a collar and a chain around his neck, and remember he was 10, and tied him to a boab tree in Roebourne. He was left with a pannikin of water, he said, but moving around the tree to try and stay in the shade in this sort of blistering summer, he knocked over the water. The cop came back, he said, the next afternoon. He was there chained to this tree. And the cop was dragging 2 Indigenous men behind him, again with neck chains. The boy was released, given a clip around the ears and told to go on. Now this man told me that terrible story in a simple, matter-of-fact way. When I said that I was appalled as an Australian by what had happened, he just laughed. He said, oh, well, that was the way things were. That's life. That was life. We live with variations of the same kind of racism. Well, I think we're getting much better, certainly young Australians. I'm getting the wind up. Can you stay with me for a few more minutes? As an ABC reporter, we mentioned I covered the 1967 referendum, where overwhelmingly Australian voters did the right thing. Important symbolic victory, I think, like the also came to be. And later I went to New York and Washington and covered the black movement there, and was a great learning experience. I came home and I travelled the outback with Fred and was shocked by the discrimination and the disadvantage that we still saw after I'd seen the American experience, and the sickness and the suicides and the total absence of housing and jobs and the ease with which we threw blackfellas into prison. Much of this Aboriginal other world still exists today, of course, 30 years later. I kept hearing stories about the way we treated the first Australians. People kept talking to me as they do. Like I launched one of Bryce Courtney's best-selling books, a novel called Jessica, about a white woman living in the Murrumbidgee irrigation area, who goes mad, as she say, about the local Wiradjuri people. I made a film for Channel 7 about this called Jessica. Anyway, that morning after the launch, I was having a cup of coffee and a woman came up to talk to me. It turned out she was the librarian at the Narrandera Council Library, the same town where Bryce had based the story. And she said that the previous reconciliation week she had put up in the library some old black and white photos of the local Wiradjuri people taken in the late 1800s, late 1800s. She told me a regular book borrower whom she knew, an old man who'd been a school teacher there, walked around looking at the photos as she stamped his books. You know, he said, I'll tell you a terrible story. When I was about 6, one Sunday morning, my father and my uncle took me down to one of the Aboriginal camps on an island in the Murrumbidgee River near here. It was a shooting party. Dad had warned me. Now the old man said he heard gunfire, but he never saw anybody shot. When he and the librarian worked out the timeline for this, they figured this Sunday morning shooting party had to be sometime back in the late 1930s. 1930s, not 1830s. What appalls me when I think about it, the old man said to her, rather pensively, is not just that my father and uncle would do such a thing, but that they would take along a 6-year-old boy as if it was one of those white fella rites of passage. Now, quickly mind, as kids we always knew that our heritage was Irish, Catholic and absolutely working class. Now, in Grandma's lounge room there was an old, tattered, framed photograph on the mantelpiece of grandfather and his 2 younger brothers. They died before I came along, I didn't know them. But my sisters and I used to look at the photo and whisper that one of the brothers, our great uncle, looked like, wait for it, a black fella. We certainly never said it out loud until years later when my sister Kay started doing the family tree, and sure enough she stumbled across this Aboriginal link of Bertha, as I said. We couldn't find whether Bertha actually married my great-great-grandfather William Laney, but she certainly had born him 2 children, John and Jane. on my mother's side. When I asked my mother, who was the least racist person I've met, why she never told us, she just said, well, it wasn't that important. Of course it was that important in a close family, where they knew everybody's indiscretion and dalliance as they do in families. There were no secrets in my family. This Aboriginal connection had just been conveniently swept under the rug. Clearly being working class, and working class poor in a racist country town, the last thing you wanted to own up to was being Aboriginal as well, and so they didn't. It was some years after my mother died that I was lucky enough to be the subject, as Karen said, of that marvellous SBS show, Who Do You Think You Are? And they do amazing research. We spoke to Aboriginal elders, and we got the local records, and even went to Tipperary Island, where William Laney had been a ploughman, until he and two cousins robbed a Church of England prelate of 15 quid. It was a capital offence, so they escaped the gallows. They got life in New South Wales instead. That was 1829. About 10 years later, he ended up as a shepherd on a vast cattle station in the wild country out the back of Gunnedah, without police, without priests, and certainly without white women. So William and Bertha had their two children, as it happened at a critical time in racial violence. Jane was actually born in 1838, the year of the nearby Mile Creek Massacre, they mentioned, when up to 50 Aboriginal people were slaughtered by white stockmen, and for the first time in Australian history when white fellows were actually hanged for murdering Aborigines. It didn't happen much in the century after. On the SBS show, a barrister historian sat in the dry riverbed of a nearby property called Cockabouy, which my great-great-grandfather had owned and acquired somehow, probably illegally, along with 400 head of cattle and 50 horses. The barrister had the old man's last will and testament when he died in 1851. The lifer from Tipperary had died quite a wealthy man, probably illegally, as I said. But the barrister explained to me that at the time most of his Irish and English mates out in the country would have been saying, let's get rid of these savages. They're causing too much trouble and killing too many sheep and too many cattle. But my great-great-grandfather specified in his will, I leave all my goods and chattels to my beloved children. My beloved children, who were dismissed in those times, of course, as half-castes. That, the barrister insisted, would have been a bold and deliberate political statement at the time. My beloved children. William Laney went up in my opinion immediately when I heard that. The bad news is that because he and Bertha were never married, the two kids were legally bastards, and under Australian law until about 1973, I think, they were entitled to nothing. So the old man's fortune went into the coffers of the British government. William Laney must be turning in his Irish Republican grave with that fact. But again, I make the point that I had been deeply committed to the reconciliation movement long before this family revelation. Still, that's my blackfella blood connection, of which I'm immensely proud. And it's a reminder that a great many Australians whose colonial ancestors went bush, in the 1800s without white women may also have Aboriginal connections the family has never talked about or owned up to, including a lot of Tasmanians. But can I finish, Karen? Can you give me another 2 minutes? Let me finish with some recent stories I think are relevant, which I think are relevant to this upcoming Bush referendum. I did a documentary for SBS last month, Easter Sunday, with Woretemoeteyenner called Mysteries of the Outback. It was an exquisitely filmed show in which I took Australia's best landscape photographer, Ken Duncan, way up back along the Queensland Northern Territory borders. From Bursville to a place called Urandangi, the most remote harbour I've ever had a beer in. Burke and Wills country, where Ludwig Leichhardt disappeared as well. Cattle King Sidney Kidman and Aaron Williams all rode their horses and drove cattle through there. The biggest stations, cattle stations in the world, the best cattle fattening country in Australia, and breathtaking country. It was also one of the most savage killing fields of Aboriginal Australians, along with the Northern Territory and the Kimberleys. The Queensland Tourism Department paid for that documentary. So before we began picking up what Dave was saying, I asked them, what about the massacres and the shameful treatment of Indigenous people out there? How do I tell that story in a tourism documentary? And to their credit, given these times, the Queensland tourist bosses said to me, just tell the truth. It's time in Australia for a dose of truth and reconciliation. It is time, so we told the truth. Now, I spent much of the lockdown, COVID lockdown months, years reading books and newspaper articles and diaries from some of those stations. And even I was shocked by the intensity and the extent of the violence and the slaughter. They're events that happened more than 100 years ago, some more recent, but they live on in the memories and in the trauma of Indigenous people today, as we found out. We, of course, we're not guilty, but we must openly acknowledge what happened if we are to be truly reconciled, in Tasmania especially. There are no written Aboriginal records, of course, of Burke and Wills in 1861 racing to the Gough through maybe the fiercest of the clans, the Kalkadoon people up there. They were wild men who speared anyone, black or white, who trespassed on their country without permission. But in Kalkadoon folklore, they didn't write it down, they passed the word on. The warriors didn't kill these hapless explorers, Burke and Wills, because they were terrified of the strange animals they rode, thinking they might be devils. They were talking about the camels. And 160 years later, the camel stories have been passed on down to their people. So imagine then what impact the slaughter at Battle Creek must have had on the Kalkadoon people. Just outside of Cloncurry in 1884, the white police and settlers decided to draw a line in the sand. They'd had enough of blackfellas' attacks on the station families and on the miners and spearing cattle. And the guerrilla raids, all meant to get rid of these white invaders who'd taken their sacred lands. When it was over, this battle, it's called Battle Mountain, a full-blooded battle, spears and rocks against sophisticated American-built automatic repeater rifles. It's a guess, because nobody knows, but about 900 Kalkadoon warriors lay dead. 900, the blackfellow resistance up there was finished with that one battle. Rachel Perkins is, of course, the leader, one of the leaders of the Voice Referendum at the moment. Her more famous father, Charlie Perkins, as Canberra's Chief of Aboriginal Affairs, unveiled a monument at that spot where the massacre occurred 100 years later in 1984. Does anyone know about these macabre events? It's not in the history books. About 4 hours drive north of there is a cattle station called Lawn Hill. In the 1870s, a visiting white woman wrote in her diary that she and others were going across the Lawn Hill for a lovely weekend of tennis. Her diary was published a few years ago. In it, she jokingly notes that there are 40 pairs of blackfella ears nailed to the outside walls of the station house as a warning to local Indigenous people to stay away. You know, in the 1870s, in 12 of the 14 cattle stations in the Gough country, they had a shoot on sight policy with Aboriginal people, like dingoes, shoot on sight. I'll pass through some other stories I was going to tell because I am seriously getting it wind up. But there's a hanging tree on the Georgina River that's still there. A hanging tree. Google hanging tree and you'll get the information about that. And everywhere I've travelled around Australia in recent times, I keep getting these stories, these same sort of massacre stories. I was telling my wife some of this gory details when I was researching it, and she put her hands on her ears and said, look, I don't need to know this stuff. It's too terrible. But we do need to know it, and it is terrible. And we need to know it, we need to understand where we are today. I'm going to quickly jump into this. Of course they are too horrible, but to comprehend the pain and the suffering of the first Australians, there still is with many of them today, as Dave is talking about, to understand why so many are so depressed and so suicidal and find it hard to go on. We do need this truth and reconciliation process. And it's against this horrible history that we have a referendum. As I said, you're not guilty, I'm not guilty, but we have a chance to again say sorry and do the right thing. It's not enough to simply say that, yeah, Indigenous people were treated terribly. Some of them were shot and we poisoned some water holes and a lot died from English smallpox. It was much, much more brutal and terrifying than that. So as I said a moment ago, it's this history, old and recent, that Australia needs to do the right thing. It's because of this we need to do the right thing with this voice referendum. More importantly, I think Australia needs to do the decent thing. So don't let the fearmongers, if you haven't made your mind up, don't let the fearmongers try to scare you. There's nothing to lose with this referendum, and there's everything to gain. They tried to scare us with the Mabo ruling and the native title. We were going to lose our homes and our farms, we were told. Rubbish, it never happened. Saying sorry would be a financial disaster, Prime Minister Howard told me. We'd be paying billions and billions in compensation for blackfellas. Again, rubbish, it never happened. We're doing the same scare tactics again now. This is not about politics, as Albo said yesterday, I think, or last night at the speech I heard this morning. Not about politics, it's not a political issue. It's about doing the decent thing. It's about basic human rights, like equality for women. It was not about politics, it was about the decent thing. So despite the best attempts by Peter Dutton and the National Party dinosaurs and some other white and black fella opponents, I honestly don't understand what it is that Michael Mansell and Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price and the others are opposing at the moment. Will a voice referendum fix the Aboriginal disadvantage? No, of course it won't. It's an important incremental step forward. It's an important symbol, a symbol that we do really care. Imagine what message we'll send to Indigenous Australians and to the world if we vote no this time. There will be problems, of course. There are going to be log jams and public service stuff-ups with the voice. There always is when you change the system. That's all right, we're pretty smart people, we can sort that out. It's really very simple, don't complicate things. It's about giving formal constitutional recognition to the first Australians who were in this beautiful country 60-odd thousand years ago. Of course they should be recognised, acknowledged. It's the 97% of non-Aboriginal Australians who need to do it, not the other 3% of Indigenous Australians. Instead of telling Indigenous people what to do, where they can live, who they can marry, how we should take away their children, how to fix their problems, as we've done for 200 years badly, why not give them a voice? Why not listen to them for the first time ever? What have we got to lose? It doesn't mean any government has to do what they demand, no veto powers. All we must do is listen. Pretty simple, listen. So let me say it again, very simple. Don't complicate things. Don't let Michael Mansell and others complicate it. It has nothing to do with politics. It's about doing the right and decent thing at last. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Ray. I would now like to invite you back up to the stage. I just thought I'd wait till you sat down and Dave for a Q&A from the audience.
Good are you?
Don't ask about the drinking.
What's your favourite?
Broken mic? Broken mic. Don't be shy.
Thank you to both of you this morning for the presentations and sharing with us your story and culture. You both touched on it in slightly different ways, but if the referendum later in the year does not succeed, where do you think that puts us as a country, and how far back does it set us for cultural change and maturity to be able to give proper recognition, but also fixing some of those huge gaps we see with societal issues, with our general truth-telling with our history, the way our children are educated? What are the dangers, I suppose, is the question.
I think, well, like I said up there, is there's several things that are driving forwards, and they're all, we're at this point in history where I suppose the reconciliation movement that Ray talks about, his journey, the recognition, the constitution, the truth-telling, the treaty, the voice, all of this is travelling along because it all needs to be travelling along. The journey has led to the steps that need to be changed in politics. So the constitutional reforms, all of these things that have been progressing over all of these years from champions, Aboriginal champions that have worked hard to say what is needed and required, but then for government and you know, to try to work through how does these things actually work. And Ray touched on it in growing up, Mabo, the fear of change, and what happens if there is a door that's open, and what would that mean to the system that everybody's comfortable sitting in. So I just think it's really, really not, if we don't keep moving, if we're seen to block or go against things that are opportunities, it could put us back a long way, especially with people like the loss of Yonapingu and people that have worked so hard to try to get on their journeys to get to where we are today. I don't know what comes first, but certainly they're all happening at once, and I feel that needs to be happening. Besides, I'm not else to say.
Yeah, but my great mentor was Fred Hollow, as I mentioned earlier. He had this mantra. He used to say, the alternative is to do nothing, and that's not an alternative. So that's very true. We have no choice. I'm not quite as gloomy and grim as Albo is about if we lose. I hope to goodness we don't, and I think it'll be shameful if we vote no. But I think the train's left the station. I think reconciliation is happening. And certainly you talk to young Australians like my children and their mob, and they realise we have to fix what Sir William Dean called the festering sore, which is the Aboriginal problem, quote unquote. You know, we pay, pick a figure, it's really rubbery, $30 billion a year taxpayers pay to try and solve the Aboriginal problem, as it's called. And we're not closing the gaps. We're doing it wrong. There are no black fellas driving around in Rolls Royces as a result of this money, but it's simply, as they say in the classic, peed up against the wall. So we need to fix that. So I think we're on the way. I think reconciliation is happening. It's just as Dave was saying earlier, and every Indigenous person in this room would know is just too slow. And we're losing generations of young people because of this racist past that I talked about. But I'm very optimistic. I just think we're good people. And I think, like the same-sex marriage debate, fingers crossed, but when it comes to voting, we're going to do the decent thing. And that's vote yes.
Any other questions?
Sure can.
From what I understand, we can learn a lot from the Aboriginal people, and I'm sure we have, as far as looking after our climate, our country. They know a hell of a lot more about it than what we do. And why can't we have the truth being told in our schools so the children growing up understand what exactly did happen? And let's get rid of the old British history. I don't know where we go from here, but we've got to win this debate. Yeah, thank you.
I suppose part part of my bio was that I work, and Karen has, and a lot of us have worked in education space, and it is the silver bullet, as Ray said. The interesting thing is that in the government and the different departments, in addressing the truth, some departments have welcomed some of the language around what happened, which is truth-telling language, and some of them haven't. And that becomes that there's people in positions that aren't comfortable with certain language, which is words like invasion. Okay, so when that's stalling truth-telling in education because of words that people are uncomfortable with. So until people are comfortable to hear that this land was invaded and those words, then that is an issue that sits inside the department and the learning. The kids, we are very, very good at judging what we share with age groups, on determining ourselves on who and how we share those stories and the terrible past. And when they're too young, I personally talk about, as you get older, research and look into it, but when I'm dealing with mature students in university, they need to hear it and they need to understand it, because that's the reality. Certainly don't want young kids to have nightmares, but and some of the things that Ray talked about, we were probably the most intense attempted genocide in the world, in my opinion, of what happened here. The storybooks of the journals were written by the victors. In some cases there were stories of glorification of terrible murders and tortures of our people. But a lot of that stuff isn't as available as some of the other stuff. There is generational guilt and there's generational trauma, and there are families in our country that have connections to terrible past of what their families were involved with. So trying to work through that so that they can deal with that truth. And then on our side is the trauma of what occurred. So I appreciate and I thank you for what you said, and that you would like to see the truth be taught. And it's slowly getting better in the system, but when you have people in positions that aren't comfortable, then the people above them need to tell them to either be comfortable or move out, because
I'd just like to share a little bit of my personal family things that have happened with my kids. Like, people think that, like, people are ignorant to racism to Aboriginal people. They're very quick to jump on and say, oh, we're being racist to the Muslims, we're being racist to them, and then try and want to work with all these other cultures that come into Australia, but they're not as prepared to work with the Aboriginal people. Not everyone, but a lot of people aren't prepared to work with the Aboriginal people. They just want to pass them by and concentrate on the new Australians. My son, just so you know that racism is still well and truly alive, my second eldest son, who's in his 20s, early 20s, he got called an Abo nigger at school. So it's not a long gone thing. It's still a fresh thing in this world, in Australia, and we need to fix it. It needs to stop, and we need to educate our kids at home. As parents, it's our responsibility to make sure our children grow up to be respectful of each other, no matter where you're from and who you are.
That's a great question, thank you for that. I'm just going to wind up. My name's Mark Redmond, I'm CEO with Reconciliation Tasmania. Just too slow, you said it right, mate. It's just been too slow, the change that's got to happen. So it's a big year ahead. I just want to thank Dave, Karen and Ray for your wonderful presentation today, what you shared with us. Dave, some of the stuff that you talked about, the place was alive and your family's place in the river here has been an integral part of your story, is so honest and deep. So thanks for that sharing. And Ray, I must say, I'm glad you joined the circus. What you've given to Australia and to mainstream Australia about the story, your deep reconciliation commitment, I think is really deep. And I think you're right, education is the silver bullet. I'd like to thank the team too. Georgie, Barb, Marnie, Kirsten, Chris, and a range of volunteers who worked hard to get this event happening today. The theme being, be a voice for generations. Okay. What's asked from this referendum this year is very simple. It's asking for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a seat at the table, to have a say when laws that have been drafted, not made, but drafted. That's why executive government is so important to be involved, for them to have a say at the table about those laws. As Dave said, 67, you guys were counted. In 2023, you do need to be heard. And I think the thing about reconciliation, even though it's a contentious word, it now really is to me, on contemplation yesterday's forum at Ulverston, it's around the 97% of Australians here in the room and around Australia need to take action. We need to be driving reconciliation. It's about us taking responsibility. As the Uluru Statement says in the last sentence, they've asked us as a gift to walk alongside them for a better future, to make history. Let's make history this year. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge our National Reconciliation Week partners, University of Tasmania, Foraco, Hydro, Libraries Tasmania, Wellways and Key Assets. And lastly, in the year of the referendum, Reconciliation Tasmania is part of a community-based education campaign rolling out from July. We urge you to keep an eye out on our new Reconciliation Tasmania website for opportunities to book a free workshop for your enterprise, for your business and your community group and school. And come along to a conversation table to get informed about the voice. And we also look forward to anyone in the room here who wants to join us as Reconciliation Week partners in 2024. Contact Chris or any of us at RECTAS, and love to have you there. Pay respect to Six Rivers Board here today, Reconciliation Tasmania Co-Chair Claire Anderson and other Aboriginal people in the room today. Thank you for being with us, and once again, thanks Ray, Dave and Karen.